play and call it work.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to another How to Play Warhammer 40k 8th edition tutorial. Today we are going to talk about tactical objectives and scenarios and exactly how they all work together. I'll be talking first off about how the scenarios work and how you can choose them and the little nuances that you got to kind of pay attention to, especially if you're coming from 7th edition, the little changes that have happened. And then I want to talk about tactical objectives and how they work too, because especially for new players it might be a little confusing whether you need to use a deck, not use a deck, how you roll them, etc. And if you're from 7th edition as well, there's one little misconception that you've probably been having that hopefully we will fix as you watch this. Let's take a look at the rules. Now, discounting all the special missions at the back of the book for Planet Strike and Cities of Death and all of that, there are three main places to find scenarios in the Warhammer 40k rulebook. And that is in the open play area, the narrative play area, and the match play area. Each of these has their advantages and disadvantages. For example, these are the open play missions: Annihilation, Hold at All Costs, and Death or Glory. Their advantages are they're simple to learn, they play really fast, and they just use power level for the most part. Disadvantages is that they're a little too simple and can be a little one-sided once you figure out the game. So they're great for beginners, but you're going to want to move on from them pretty soon. But I do suggest that your very first game actually uses the Annihilation mission. Either way, every single scenario is going to have several things in common. Each scenario will tell you how you build your army. This is called the armies. Each of them is going to tell you how to create your battlefield. Now, this one just says create the battlefield and set up terrain. And that basically talks about, in an earlier part of the book, you just going back and forth with your opponent, setting up terrain. That's not what we do. We just set it up in a thematic way, and then we play on it. It then tells you how to do your deployment. You've got to pay close attention to this and make sure you read every word, because it'll be very specific as to who chooses sides, how you alternate deployment, who gets first turn. In this case, Death or Glory, there's an attacker and defender. So the first turn, the defender can choose whether to have the first or second turn. And battle length is how many turns you have. This is 5 battle rounds, or until one army has slain all of its foes. And it tells you the victory conditions of winning the game too. Now, it also will have special rules, and these three missions don't have any real special rules, but they'll detail all those in the actual scenarios themselves. The narrative play mission rules start to get a little more interesting, and they have a lot of fun stuff in them. So before we even get to the scenarios, we have the couple pages that go over different things like what is concealed deployment, what is dawn raid, what is preliminary bombardment, what is random battle length. I'm not going to go through all of them here because you can simply just read what they are. But for example, if it says it has random battle length, then at the end of the battle round 5, the player who had the first turn, remember it's important who rolls because they can use command points to reroll, they must roll a d6. On a 3+, the game continues, otherwise the game is over. At the end of battle round 6, the player who had the second turn, not the first turn, second turn rolls a d6, and the game will continue on a 4+, otherwise the game ends, and the battle automatically ends at the end of battle round 7. You'll actually see this is very common for a lot of the match play scenarios as well. So that is random battle length. Pay close attention. It is very important when they say who does dice rolling, because all of a sudden if you have command points left, or if you want to hold on to command points knowing that you are going to be the one to decide whether the game continues, sometimes you want the game to end and sometimes you want it to continue. So I'm not so much giving you tactical advice here as it is make sure you pay close attention to the rules so that nobody loses the opportunity to do something tactical because you simply did not know who it is that was supposed to be rolling. Then there's other rules like reserves, sentries, sustained assault, and so on. And then we have a bunch of really cool missions. And I talked about stratagems and command points before, and narrative play really adds a lot more stratagems. I've seen most of them, if not all of them, have 6 new stratagems, 3 for the attacker and 3 for the defender in this case, and in that case as well. So what you basically will see at this point is they'll add in extra rules like sustained assault. It'll show you the deployment type, and you have to be very careful to see that there is actually different types of deployment here, and it tells you how far away from each other they have to be. It tells you how to do deployment, how to do the terrain, and then all the extra special stratagems that you have access to. And so since these are narrative, you have to remember that you can choose these narrative play ones and say, hey, let's do a matched play, but using this mission. You can mix and match it however you like. You can do points with this. You could do power level with this. You could choose to do Battle Forged with it or not Battle Forged with it. You can really break whatever rules you want as you do your missions, as long as you and your opponent both agree. So these are called Crucible of War missions, and they're really good for narrative play. If you're playing these, then you need to play to a narrative. If you both are out there trying to make the most killy list possible, then you're probably missing the point of these missions, and they'll probably be one-sided because they're not meant to be balanced, they're meant to be narrative, hence narrative missions. If you really want to have more of a slugfest and seeing who is the better player, then a better place to go, and then we have our historical battles as well, which we can come back to, is under matched play. Match play is the competitive side of 40k. I say that, but at the same time, you could totally play match play and be playing friendly. It's just more if you are going to be competitive, then match play is the best place to be because it'll give you your ideas of how many detachments, and it'll give you your ideas of the match play rules. For example, in a match play mission, you can only cast the same psychic power once per psychic phase unless it is smite. And you cannot, this is where it says the same stratagem cannot be used by the same player more than once during any single phase. In tactical reserves, at least half of your army has to be set up on the table. We talked about setting up guys in dropping reserve or underground reserve or hidden reserve. If you're doing match play, you have to have at least half of your number of units on the table to start. And on top of that, anybody who does not arrive by the end of turn 3 is counted as being dead. And it has a limit to how you build your armies. Your allies have to be the same faction keyword as your other detachments. And it also talks about reinforcement points. Now this one's really important, so let's talk about that for a second. And reinforcement points in a match play, if you have any ability that lets you create new units, not repopulate existing units. So for example, apothecaries can heal units and bring them back. The Tervagon and Tyranids can add new Termagants to an existing Termagant squad. But it is also able to create a new squad. Demons have a lot of summoning where they can be summoned in and create new squads. Anything that creates fresh, new units, you must already have points set aside. So let's say you're playing a 2,000 point game and you build 1,800 points and you set the other 200 points aside. You don't actually declare what they're going to be. You just say, I have 200 points for my reinforcements. And then you want to summon in a unit of demons with one of your psychic powers or one of your abilities, and that unit costs 100 points. Well, then you can take 100 points of your 200 points and create that unit. If you don't have any reinforcement points, then you can't summon a new unit. You can't create a new unit. But that is in match play. This is the important distinction, is that is match play. If you want to go narrative and not worry about that, that is totally fine. That is exactly what you and your opponent can decide to do. But it's probably good to get used to match play because I'm guessing that most people are going to want to play that. And most tournaments and events will run things in match play. In match play, there's 12 missions. There are 6 Eternal War and 6 Maelstrom. You can just agree to which one you're playing, or you can roll on these tables. The Eternal War missions are, and these are the standard deployments, which we'll talk about in a second. Eternal War are more straightforward. There's objectives on the table, and you have to get them at the end of the game, or there's a relic on the table that whoever controls at the end wins, or you just have to kill more of your opponent than they kill of you, etc., etc. Whereas the Maelstrom of War uses tactical objectives, which we will talk about in a second, which provide a much more dynamic and probably a bit more random experience for what it is that you are trying to achieve in the mission. It is my personal favorite to be playing tactical missions. If I'm not doing narrative, then I love tactical objectives because they force an opponent to think on their feet, and also it really challenges you to do more than just sit back and fire with your guns. It forces you to try to take control of the table, and it brings the fight all over the table, which I really, really, really enjoy. And of course, if they use stratagems, then you always have this extra stratagem if you're doing tactical objectives, which lets you immediately discard a tactical objective and generate a new one for 2 command points. So let's go back and talk about our deployment types. Now, we already talked about this in the deploying and setting up mission, but I just want to talk about it once again. These are the 6 standard deployment maps. Now, if you're doing the narrative ones, they'll have their own. The open play talks about having their own as well. So these are mostly used in the match play scenarios, but you can also make up your own scenarios and use these as a base for it. Essentially, whoever's determining the deployment type will roll randomly one of these. Now, I know it says determine, but in this little sidebar right here, it says when playing match play missions, you must randomly select one of the deployment maps. To do so, one of the players simply rolls a d6, and the mission will typically say which player makes this roll. If not, it is made by the youngest player. And that's who, of course, can use a command point to re-roll it unless an FAQ has come out stating otherwise. So you get the 6 different types, as we already talked about, so I don't want to go into more details of that. I want to spend more time talking about tactical objectives. But let's talk about a couple more things for the missions first. A lot of the match play scenarios will have 3 extra secondary objectives. One called Slay the Warlord, one called First Blood, and one called Line Breaker. Not all of them have this, but not all scenarios have this, but the match play ones pretty much all do. Slay the Warlord is just if the enemy warlord has been slain during the battle, you score 1 victory point. Essentially, when you're creating your army, when you go to deploy, you select one model to be your warlord. There's actually a section for warlord traits, that if he's a character, you can choose one of the 3 warlord traits and he gets that extra little bonus. But if your opponent kills it, they get an extra victory point. And victory points are usually the way to determine who wins. For example, grabbing objectives might give you 3 victory points. Killing a unit might give you a victory point. It all depends on the mission you're playing. First Blood, the first unit of any kind to be destroyed during the battle is worth a victory point to the opposing player at the end of the game. If 2 or more units from opposing forces are destroyed simultaneously, which is very unlikely, then both players get 1 victory point. And so the first person to kill it, it's a unit, not model. So if I kill one of the models out of your unit, but I do not kill the entire unit, then I do not get First Blood. And then Line Breaker, if at the end of the battle you have at least 1 model within the enemy's deployment zone, you score 1 victory point. Once again, if you're coming from 7th, this is different. It used to be the entire unit had to be within the deployment zone, and now it's just 1 model has to be within. It doesn't even say entirely within. There's a big distinction there. If it says within, only part of it has to be within. If it says entirely within, then the entire model has to be entirely within it. So all of them pretty much share these, plus whatever the main objective for that mission is. Finally, let's talk about tactical objectives. Now, this is the part, if you're new, that can be a little confusing, and if you've played 7th edition, there's probably one thing that you're doing wrong. Tactical objectives, there are 36 of them. You can see them in the book here. There's 6, 6, and then there's more. They're all numbered from 1-1 to 1-6 to 2-1 to 2-6 and so on and so forth. If you're unfamiliar with role-playing games and other systems, this is called a D66 table. This is where we roll 2 D6. One of them counts as tens and one of them counts as the units. It is very useful to use different colored dice when rolling this. For example, I could use the black dice and the white dice, and the black one would be the tens and the white one would be the ones. And so when I roll it, what I rolled right there is a 34, not 7. If I roll it again, now we've got a 16, not 7. And that will tell you which of the objectives that you are to have. Every mission will have its own rules as to how many tactical objectives. The basic one, for example, you just get up to 3 per turn, but you only replenish back up to 3. So if you haven't completed them, then you don't get new ones. If you've completed 2 of them, you would generate 2 more. And so all of them will tell you exactly how many that are to be done. But what they will all have in common is you can never get the same tactical objective twice. So if you are rolling those 2 dice and marking down which ones you got, make sure you write down the number, because even though this says secure objective 3 and this says secure objective 3, and they are identical, their numbers are not identical. So you could roll a 1-3, then if you roll the 2-3, you did not get the same objective. Even though it says the same word, secure objective 3, it is not the same one. Whereas if you rolled a 2-3 and then you rolled another 2-3, then you'd have to re-roll that until you get something that's unique. A really useful tool for that are the tactical objective cards. So this is exactly the same cards. These are not required whatsoever, but we like to use them. So there's the 36 tactical objectives. These are in order right now. So what you would do is you would shuffle them, and much better than what I just did right there. And when it says draw 3 objectives, for example, you would simply draw 1, 2, 3 objectives, and you look at them. At the end of your turn, if you've completed any of these, then you would discard it, but you get the point for it. And this is how many current active tactical objectives that you still have. Now, if you're coming from 7th edition, here's the part that you probably are doing wrong. Maybe you caught it, like when we didn't at first, and we caught it later on. But when you achieve tactical objectives, when do you achieve them? It says at the end of every turn, yours and the enemy's. In 7th edition, you could only achieve your tactical objectives at the end of your turn. So this one, for example, defend objective 2, says score 2 victory points if you control objective marker 2 at the end of 2 consecutive turns. We were reading that at first to mean, at the end of my turn, I control it. And then at the end of my following turn, I control it again, I get the 2 victory points. But that's not what it means, because you actually check at the end of your and your enemy's turn. So essentially at the end of my turn, if I control the objective, and then the end of my enemy's turn, I still control the objective, boom, I've got my defend objective 2. It gets removed from my active tactical objectives, and I score those 2 victory points. Even weird things can happen, like advance says score a victory point, if no unit from your army is within your deployment zone at the end of, oh, this one specifies, at the end of your turn. So I was about to say that that could happen about them killing guys in your deployment and nobody's left. But this one actually specifically says at the end of your turn. So the idea is that you've left your deployment. So just like that, that's a really good example there of making sure you read them nice and closely exactly how they work. Big Game Hunter. Score 1 victory point if at least one enemy with a wounds characteristic of 10 or more was destroyed during this turn. So that could happen that if your opponent charges you with a monster or a vehicle that has at least 10 wounds and you kill it in Overwatch or you kill it in the fight phase, then at the end of this turn, you get your victory point. A lot of these tactical objectives will have a secondary objective that gets you even more victory points. This one, for example, says that at least one enemy unit with a wounds characteristic of 20 or more was destroyed this turn. Score D3 victory points instead. And of course, you're the one rolling that D3, so you could always use a command point to re-roll it. Just want to get your mind into gear of what it is that you get to achieve. Now, you can also discard tactical objectives. Once the tactical objective has been achieved, it is discarded. After the achieved tactical objective has been discarded, the player whose turn it is can select one of their remaining active tactical objectives and choose to discard it. This scores no victory points. So if at the end of my turn, I'm like, okay, I got this one, but I didn't get these two. And my opponent, it's going to be really hard for me to get Big Game Hunter. So I'm just going to discard this. I don't get any points for it, but at least it's out of my hand, which frees it up for new ones to be drawn, because most missions will say redraw back up to 3, or you can't have more than X number of cards at all. One last thing to talk about for tactical objectives is how you hold objectives. A lot of them say secure objective 4, score a victory point if you control objective marker 4 at the end of your turn, etc., etc. Now, this actually works for Eternal War missions too, and a lot of the narrative missions, but they may have their own specific rules of how you control, so make sure you read those before you go any further. Basically, you control an objective. Let's call this an objective marker right here. If you have more models within 3 inches of the center of it than your opponent. It's important that I say within the center of it, because different objectives are going to be different. Your opponent might bring a tactical, or he might bring his own set of objectives and they're really cool looking. Or maybe we're going to count this big thing as an objective, but we still measure from the center of it. So right now, for example, the Space Marine player would control this objective because he has more models within 3 inches than the Tyranid player. But let's say I had these guys back this way, then nobody controls it because we both have the same number of models within 3 inches of the center of it. So obviously units with larger numbers of models are going to have an easier time controlling objectives. So just remember to declare which ones are objectives, and that way you can use fancy stuff like this statue as an objective, but you're still going to have to measure from the middle, which is going to create a lot less space for you to be able to control it. And of course, as usual, to help you to learn this even better, we have a battle report for you at the link in the video description below, where they are playing one of the Maelstrom of War missions that use tactical objectives, so you can see how they work. So go ahead and click that right now. If you're still not a Vault member after all these tutorials, really just try it out. 7-day free trial. You get instant access to all the battle reports that have come out so far. You can just binge watch them. If you decide you don't want it, just cancel it, and there's no obligation to continue. We really hope that you will become a Vault member, though, because it supports us and helps us to do this. The advertising revenue from YouTube is not enough to cover everything, so we rely on the support of our Vault members in order to be able to make these videos. And of course, if you have a friend that wants to learn how to play Warhammer 40k, send them to MiniWarGaming.com/how-to-play 40k. Thanks for watching. Happy wargaming.